Welcome to Leadership in Sustainability. All right, leaders create something to follow, something for others to follow. Pretty obvious. Someone said that to me the other day, but just keep in mind that it's not about battering people into taking your lead. It is about creating something that others will want to follow. And this is really about professionalism. You will be in professional positions that require you to be a leader. You may not think of yourself as a Napoleon who's out there sort of riding his horse into battle and being the great leader, but that is not what this course is about. Leadership is much more subtle and is especially important for sustainability professionals because we're dealing with something that nobody else knows about. How many times do you hear, what the heck is sustainability anyway? And then you're in a position where you really can help to show what that means. But generally, you don't know either. And that's the position that the world is in. We need to work it out together. And as you do, you find your role emerges. That's the course in a few lines. But this is an ancient skill. This is not something that we're discovering. Perhaps the application to sustainability is, but leadership has been around for some time. And the prophet in the past was not the person that led the king's battles, but was the one who set the vision and set the direction and said, no, you're going the wrong way. This is the way we should be going. So the vocation of the prophet is to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep on conjuring and proposing alternative futures to the single one the agents of the dominant culture want to urge as the only thinkable one. So I'm going to go now into the theory, and in about an hour, Renee will talk about the Creativity Project, and then we'll be set up for the rest of the time together. I'll talk a bit about sustainability first of all, particularly about how it relates to complexity and innovation, and then on leadership, the different theories and organisational processes and understandings, but particularly how it then relates to you. And in the end, leadership in sustainability is about creating hope for the future. How do we do that? So, sustainability in history, it's inherently about complexity and inherently about innovation. We're going to go into these different leadership theories that I've outlined there. I'll just go straight into the history. Miko, our first leader, has arrived. You can grab a seat and hear about all the theory and then forget about all that, and we'll talk to Miko after morning tea. Now, most of you will have seen this endlessly. The story of sustainability began in the 60s when we started to understand some of the deeper environmental problems that went beyond the immediate locale. You know, fixing up the environment has been around for centuries, of course, but it was crossing boundaries, going across the world. Everybody had chlorinated hydrocarbons in their blood systems. Even the penguins in the Antarctic were getting it, and it was because of particular approaches that Rachel Carson outlined in her book Silent Spring, which was about the bird life that was no longer singing in springtime. And she died of cancer not long after this, but it started a whole movement to say the environment is basically being forgotten, and you can't do that. It began to be a worldwide movement in the 70s, so the UN World Conference on the Human Environment alone was set up in 72, and a whole lot of processes began. So around the world we had lots of environmental initiatives. EPAs were set up, environmental regulations, and the whole environmental science profession began. I was at Murdoch in 74 helping to start off environmental science. It was a new way of doing things, and it was a very important step forward. But then you started to see that the approaches were becoming the social and economic and political aspects of environmental things began to rise up. And you had people like Paul Ehrlich, who I worked with in Stanford in the 70s, saying essentially development's got to stop because development's associated with environmental destruction, and we've just got to stop it. The planet's not big enough for all these people. We've got to scale right back. Now, the Third World were not too pleased about this. When 1 billion people were going to bed hungry, they thought this is not a good approach. We need to develop. We are not in a position where we can worry about this environment thing. So you had a fight, a global fight. And that global fight began to be played out on the world scene. And the Brundtland report was done to try and resolve that fight and to bring together the forces of environment and the forces of economics and social development and saying, can't we do this together, guys? Don't we have a common future? And sustainable development was born. We then had the world trying to say, well, what the heck does that mean? Even though we like the idea that somehow or other we can do these things together, what does it mean? And a range of things coming through the Rio UN World Conference on Environment and Development. We just had the 20-year follow-up to that in Rio in 2012. But various conferences, and eventually they became summits on sustainable development. So in pictures, it was essentially about economic development going in one direction, environmental protection in another, and a fight emerging and the need to bring them together, and finally to bring them into a sustainability framework where you had social, economic and environmental protection occurring simultaneously. And that has been the sustainability journey we've begun. And we at Murdoch, we started sustainable development there in '89 as a course. It was the first one in the world. It only just come up as an issue, but we couldn't find anywhere else that was doing it. And we were certainly jumping in very early on this. And since then, we've been trying to show how that area in the middle can get bigger as we provide the synergies between these areas. So sustainability has come from a series of failures. Firstly, a failure to consider environmental and social issues in development, which is really about stopping economic fundamentalism. That if you just say, if it's good for the economy, it's good for everything. Not so. Failure of professions to see beyond their manuals, the simplistic manuals, and you'll find there's a common theme in all this literature. And modernism is about bringing it down to a simple set of manuals. This is the one best way to do it, and we can teach you this, and you go out and do it. Unfortunately, there's a whole lot of complications about how to do it that we hadn't thought of. But anyway, so the anyway is now emerging as a major issue. And failure to include ethics. The whole development thing was just technical. Just go ahead and do it. And unfortunately, long-term issues, community values were left. So we will use this word legacy, won't we, Miko? And the long-term legacy of companies, of governments, of community groups began to be on the agenda. And I found it very freeing. As a person who had a strong ethical upbringing and tried to bring that into my work, I found it enormously liberating to be able to talk about ethics. because up until then you weren't allowed to. You know, it was kind of like swearing in church. This is not what you do. You know, if you're a professional, you don't talk about ethics. Well, we do now. And partly that's due to the sustainability revolution. Now, it's highly complex, obviously, to bring together the economic, the social and the environmental. We're not trained to do it. Still, the vast majority of university training is in those separate categories. Who brings it together? Sustainability professionals. Who are we? Well, we're just a tiny little fraction of the world, aren't we? We're trying to show how to bring it together. But it's more than just those disciplines that have to be brought together. It's also the sectoral dimensions, because the market, the community and government all play roles and different roles. And you've got to bring them together in this whole process as well. The market's about short-term goals to produce goods and services. The community, I'll come to that last. Government is about medium-term regulations and infrastructure. And the community are about the long term. Where is it going? The values and the visions. Now, sustainability is about bringing them together. So, easy to say, but it's really about complexity being simplified to enable us to do something. And I'll try to give you some stories about how I think some of that's happened. And we will find out from some of the leaders about that. It's also about innovation. Now, complexity theory is now a very complex area of study. Some people are totally addicted to this stuff. I find it totally off-putting myself, but complex adaptive systems, chaos theory, these are, you know, important literatures. But don't get stuck in it. I've heard people at seminars where we're trying to solve a problem say, well, look, we just have to step back and understand the chaos theory approach to this, you know, and after half an hour you've got 10 or 20 words that you've started to understand, but you're no closer to solving the problem. Recognising that it's a system and it's complex, that's enough, you know. Just recognise that and get on with it is my view, but some of you will be into this and I don't want to offend you too much. There's one guy on the main roads who we all know well, and every time he comes to a seminar he says, but have you thought about... Oh, yes, Ed, we have. There's a fantastic article about wicked problems in the Readers. This is a simple approach to complex adaptive systems and wicked problems, and I think it's astonishing that it emerged out of the Howard government era. But that's the way, I mean, obviously a group of people got together and said, why can't we write something about this? And it's floated through the system. And, you know, this is the time when the world's problems were reduced to stopping boats. Anyway, it is a good read. One of the people who is easier to read is Snowden, and he has sorted out problems into those that are simple, complicated, chaotic or complex. And most of our issues are in the complex domain or framework, and they need to be dealt with using emergent practices. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Again, this is not new. Aristotle had a few things to say about complexity. He said there are two ways of thinking. There's first road thinking and second road thinking. Now we're talking about 2,000 years before Christ. The early civilizations in the European area. And he said first road thinking is about logic. If A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C. So you just follow through the logic of things. And this leads to how you analyse problems. It leads to science. And it leads to modernism. And accounting. Get it down to a few simple numbers and then you're right. You've got a complex problem, find out a key performance indicator and everything will be fixed. Unfortunately, it isn't. And he recognised that. He said, look, it's very powerful, but it's limited. He said, if you want to know how big the empire is, use first road thinking. And you'll get down very close to the size of it in area and the population of the empire. But if you want to say, how do we govern the new colonies? Don't start with logic. It's not going to help. And yet the training so often, and still today, is about that logic approach. And you bring the accountants and the engineers who are very good on numbers, and you bring them in and they look at this and say, all right, we'll find key performance indicators and best practice and we'll just do it without thinking about it and trying to understand the problems. And this is where Aristotle said we need second road thinking. He called it rhetoric. These days that's a word we don't like. It's all about rhetoric, just talk. Talk is important, especially when you don't know what to do. Start talking. He said, have creative dialogue. It's why he created the polis. The polis was the first democratic political process, as long as you weren't a woman or a slave. But the good men of Athens were brought together to have a nice discussion about all these complex problems. They were the wicked problems. And they began to sort them out because they got different approaches being brought together. Now you'll find that this comes through time and again in the leadership area. If you think it's all about getting a very clear and straight, simple solution that comes from on high and just drive it through, well, that's not leadership, actually. Second road thinking, where you start to work together in a complex problem, is what sustainability is mostly about. Most of our issues are in the second road. So if you don't like talking to each other, you're in the wrong profession. Now, innovation theory is something that also needs to be part of this. We talk about it in Resilient Cities. I think it's in chapter 2, not in the chapter you were given. But if you want to read our book on resilient cities, it does talk about this wave theory and technology systems. And it's very easily shown in this diagram. If you're in CUSP, you're sick and tired of me talking about this, right? But for Murdoch students, you may not have seen it. It's essentially the history of the world for the last 200 years and the next 50, and it shows how the waves of innovation in technology go through booms and busts. And in the bust period is when you need to think again and create a new kind of technological system that emerges from the other one. It takes the best of that system and puts in a whole range of new stuff. Now, the fourth wave we have been through is about cars and oil and petrochemicals, and this wave is ending. Well, it's ended. In every end of a wave, you have a downturn and a next wave coming through. The digital economy is something we've been with for a while, but the sustainability economy is emerging and joining with that digital economy in a new green economy. And there are a set of technologies that are part of that, but also ways of thinking and ways of managing. And this is what we need to come to terms with. And you will find articles in there that talk about how we provide leadership in this kind of era. The management waves changed with it. So at each time you had a different kind of industrial approach. You also had a different management approach. Capital-based localism moved into large firms, which moved into giant monopolies, and then multinational firms. We've come through the era of Fordism, hierarchical approaches, which drove the economy. And we're now in an era of networking, flexible specialisation, local scales. And each of these eras have taken quite a time to adapt to. And it's almost as though the technology's there before we're ready for it. Photovoltaics is a classic example. We're not quite sure how to fit it into the grids and how to manage it and how to subsidise it or not. And so the renewables era is something we're adapting to, but it's very much a local scale thing. So this flexible specialisation is the way firms are starting to now talk, and if you're not doing that, if you've got a hierarchical system, you generally go under. So there is an article in there, From Industrial Era Management to Knowledge Era Management. It's Yul Bean, I think, wasn't it? UHL. And now into this green economy management era. And we need to work that out. In many ways, it's emerging. The new firms that are going to be driving this new green economy, how are they going to be managed? What is leadership for them? Now, the other part about this is that makes it look like it's rather impersonal history that was sort of driven by forces from outside. I think you'll find in the literature that we give you that there is a different view of history. That it is generally driven by people who grasped the moment and shaped history. And it wasn't driven by an impersonal set of economic and technological factors. They were there, but how they grabbed it and shaped it is real history. And we're part of real history now. So the leadership theory builds on that. What do we do in this new era? It's emerging. It's a different kind of economy. It needs different kinds of people, different professions, different ways of managing government, organisations, firms. And who are going to be setting the trends for this? So the leadership theory we've got, there's certainly no one book with it all. Maybe we could write one. Brad, Mike, me, we've sort of thought we're starting to get a bit of an idea about this now. But, you know, it's a big task. So read the stuff and come back to it later and you'll find that your journey is better for it. Andre Taylor is someone we came across who was doing a PhD on this in Australia, and he had all these, there's some of the collaborative leadership, emergent leadership, creative leadership, servant-oriented leadership, team-based leadership, transformational leadership, adaptive leadership, distributed leadership, hopeful leadership. And there's a start to the list. And I'm going to just dip into it and tell you about what it means to me, really, and you need to do the same yourself. So distributed leadership is a good one to start with because it is definitely not the Napoleon type leadership. I've just been to Melbourne and I did go to the grand final, but I also went to the Napoleon exhibition, which is on there, and it's got the story of Napoleon. A person who was an outsider. He was a migrant into France. He came from Corsica. He could hardly understand his French, and yet he became the emperor. He chose the right time and place to emerge and to take the chaos that was around in the terrible time of the French Revolution and turn it into an opportunity for him. But He then became the most appalling emperor, worse than the king ever was, in terms of the excessive power and abuse that he provided, and disappeared in the end. Distributed leadership is the opposite of that. It is about a shared team approach. Leadership is the ability to build and maintain a group that performs well relative to its competition. Now, you'll hear from Brad, but let me just tell you about a most remarkable film that you can see on the website of CUSP and on Brad's website, made by Linda, showing his team in the council as they addressed a major planning issue that has divided this community for years. And each of the councillors are saying in 2 minutes what it means to them that they have now reached a point where they have to make a decision about redevelopment of the city centre. And each of them have a different approach, but together they're agreeing 100% that it has to happen and go ahead based on the kind of approaches they've brought together. Now, you may say that, yeah, well, that's what politics is all about, isn't it? But it's rare to see that kind of leadership that Brad has shown, because he didn't beat them around the head. He had no ability to do that. He had to actually enable them to come together and work it through, have the conversations, have the public reactions, and then stand up and be counted. And it's a beautiful experience to see it. And Linda and I just looked at each other and then said, wow, what a story. Because Linda's PhD is about the beginning of that journey. We were stuffed in this city, and you know, we're not a long way further on, but at least we now know what to do. We've got a council showing leadership. Not an easy thing. This article by Yul Bean is about complexity leadership in this age of knowledge economy, and it is about creating administrative processes and adaptive leadership that creates these emerging structures, enabling leadership, emergence, coming out of the processes. And we'll really, I think you'll find this as a major theme, emergence. I find it helpful. If you've got a complex problem, and we've got plenty of them, if you recognise that, and just have a time when you can begin to think about it and process it, solutions emerge in unpredictable ways. Wheatley wants us to converse. The transformational leadership paper, we have some extraordinary names in this literature. Yuckle, along with Yul Bean. Transformational leadership is one that Mike loves and we'll talk about, and it is about having some ideals that drive a process. And I think you'll see it in some of the stories we tell you. Inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, individualised consideration, responding to each team member, basically. Now, I'm going to try to apply this now, okay? I'm going to take what I think it means for sustainability in 5 areas. Start with that idea of idealised approaches, that the ethical dimension's got to be there. And in that, I'm going to talk about guns and Michael Cousins. Then we're going to talk about creativity, playing jazz, with the state sustainability strategy and the work at Argyle, which will be then developed after morning tea with Miko and Craig Salt. The learning space approach, the adaptability, and finally the hopeful approaches that are needed. Let me start with this story about Geoffrey Cousins. You heard of Geoffrey Cousins? he's really emerging on the political scene in Australia. He is responsible more than anyone for the collapse of guns. Guns is the biggest logging machine in Australia. They were based in Tasmania, but they had timber mills and so on over here, and they were a firm that was going to build the pulp mill in Tasmania. Huge, a $1 billion pulp mill. Now, Geoffrey Cousins is a retired businessman, multi-millionaire, made lots of money in all kinds of ways, particularly in advertising. He was also John Howard's advisor for 10 years. But, you know, at a distance, he would just ring him up and talk to him and get a different perspective on issues. And he got drawn into the Tasmanian issues because they're still logging some of the best old growth forest in the world, some of the most outstanding forest areas, and turning it into pulp and making paper out of it. And he was not against pulp mills, but he was against that particular one because it was the way it was being driven. And you'll find an article that I've copied for everybody, which you can give out. It was in The Age last week, and it's on the web and gone around very quickly. It's called "Tasmania's Divisive Timber Mill Project Reduced the Mighty Guns to a Pulp." Guns has gone bankrupt. Now, there are a few people who immediately knee-jerk reaction said, this is all Geoffrey Cousins' fault. He destroyed their market by undermining them and they've gone down the tube. Well, he's got a different perspective on it. Just 4 years ago, this was a $1 billion company contemplating a $2 billion investment in one of the world's largest pulp mills. It was $2 billion. The pulp mill sank the company. Guns showed reckless disregard for established procedures. The lesson to be drawn from all of this is the way Guns set about getting this proposal up. Hopefully no one will ever try again. So he goes into in this article about what they were doing. Guns helped write the legislation in the Tasmanian Parliament to prevent any kind of discussion about the future pulp mill, to prevent any kind of legal attempts to stop it. They actually helped draft the legislation. Now, how can you get that level of corruption in a system? Well, just go to Tasmania and you'll see how easy it is. It's an extraordinary place that's had a series of real failures of governance. And it was shown not long after this legislation went through, trying to prevent Guns from having any kind of critique, that the Premier of Tasmania had his house renovated by Guns. Now, you can't get any more stupid than that, can you? But they did. The arrogance is extraordinary. It reminds me of Lehman Brothers and their arrogance. They called themselves the masters of the universe. The board did. Even a week up until when they collapsed in the GFC, the biggest company ever to go down the drain, they were also incredibly arrogant. Now, the interesting thing was, how did the actual end come? Geoffrey Cousins was part of a group of social activists that essentially used the media in the rest of Australia. They could hardly get any coverage in Tasmania, but essentially the rest of Australia took it on as an issue because he did. He was very good at running this campaign. And the other person who got behind it was Tim Flannery, who's an author. Now, essentially, you don't need a lot of people to stand up, but you need someone. And these guys were two of the only people who did. He said this: Such was the awe in which Guns was held, so palpable was the fear of lawsuits and other intimidation for which the company was renowned, that only a few brave souls spoke out, and they were hounded, persecuted and sued. These practices include the famous Guns 20 case in which the company sued Bob Brown and other Wilderness Society officers and pretty much anyone else they could conjure up in a failed effort to silence dissenting voices. It cost the company millions. And so they exposed them. But they also had a very strong sense that the economy did not need this, and in fact, they really did need to stop the logging of old-growth forest. So it helped that there was a federal election looming and that many courageous Tasmanians risked demonisation to step forward in protest against this oppressive company and its political cronies. Risked demonisation. Now that's leadership. What he says in the end is, if you ignore community interests, contrary voices, environmental issues and proper governance, you will cause pain and suffering to your shareholders, employees and probably creditors. So it's really a nice story of how someone stood up against a major issue and demonstrated leadership. What's he doing now? He's taken on James Price Point. He's leading that campaign to try and show we do not need to destroy that bay. I don't know if you saw Catalyst last night. Have a look at that. It's extraordinary, about the dinosaur footprints that are right along there. But it is a complex issue, and you'll see this when we talk about the Argyle story, which shows the importance of companies working with Aboriginal groups. So,
some level of corruption seems to be coming in through that environmental reports too.
Yeah, it's very easy to happen, and you need to have constant awareness of how to overcome it. So you can see that this kind of leadership is driven by the ideals, and if you read any of the literature about Geoffrey Cousins, you'll see he's a very ethical person who's trying to demonstrate leadership through that. The second thing is about creativity, and we'll find ourselves coming back to this all the time. Sustainability is playing jazz. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development wrote this report about scenarios for the future, and they said there are three approaches. One's frog, first raise our growth, which means just get on with the business of business, and somehow or other the social and environmental will pop out of it at the other end. The World Business Council says doesn't work anymore. Second thing, geopolity, which is large government intervention. Sometimes we want that, don't we? Just government come in and fix it all. Well, they can make it worse too. They were the ones who regulated clearing of the wheat belt. The farmers often want to stop it, but they had to clear everything, a certain amount each year. Government failure is as bad as market failure. Now what's the solution? They say jazz. It's about partnerships, synergies, flexibility. This will come through so much of the literature. Bringing people together. It's about those conversations, but you can do it in a way that's fun. That's music. That's about people showing leadership at certain times. The trumpeter comes forward and starts leading at times, and then others come in, but they're all needed. And they have got a rough idea where they're going, but it emerges good jazz. It's hard too, not easy. So take that image, that's what we're talking about, and you need to try and get some of that feeling into your creative exercises that you do. Now I was involved in producing the state sustainability strategy. We've got a copy over there. I also had 50 students from Murdoch involved in this. We got all the students who were doing theses and projects in undergraduate courses, and we got the chance to get them to come and help because we didn't know how to do a sustainability strategy. And I had one staff member to help me working from the Premier's office. I had 3 years to produce it. And we did produce it. But it was like playing jazz at the end. We produced some magic. We started not knowing what to do, and we had a lot of conversation, and we got a lot of people together, and we got a lot of background material written by students that was put on the Premier's website and enabled us to get somewhere. Some of the best case studies came forward. We had not heard of the Argyle story, which I'll tell you about next, but it was one of the ones that came out of that. And we set up a group of principles which remain, I think, very important principles in government. And although this document is not often quoted, it is the basis of the planning legislation and the local government legislation. And it is embedded in a lot of what government now does. Leadership and learning. Learning is such an important word in this, because leadership doesn't come from someone who just immediately knows what to do and gets out and does it. It comes from the learning process. And it's about policy learning. There's a whole literature on policy learning. And I'm going to give you 2 stories about this. I'll do this one quickly because I talked about this last week with the CUSP students. In the Pilbara, the BHP had a problem. They had the Scarborough gas field out here, and they didn't know how to bring it to shore. And the engineers said, bring it to Tevenard Island. It's very easy to do. Tevenard is here. It's kind of direct. The other group that was around was Chevron, and they got permission from the WA government to develop Barrow Island, even though it was a Class A nature reserve, because they'd had a long-term oil development there. Anyway, BHP engineers said, let's just do it here. Now, there was a bit of a problem about this, because developing an A-class reserve is not an easy thing to do, and it's very hard to get through. And essentially, BHP said, let's put it aside for a moment. Let's have a learning process about any other options. Let's have 3 months where we think again. Put it aside. And don't be constrained by the financial side of it. Look at all the options. Create space, which is what they did. And they did all this study, environmental constraints and socio-economic constraints and physiographic constraints. And they came up with all the sites that emerged from this. This is kind of McHarg type analysis. And then they looked at the feasible options, and they were grouping around the Burrup and around Cape Preston and around Onslow, where Tevenard is. And then they did some sensitivity work. They went out and looked at the sites, and they started talking to people. And in the conversations, they found that particularly the Onslow community were very receptive. They did literature work and workshops and independent focus groups, and they looked at these sites around the Burrup, and they said probably not, Cape Preston probably not, and Onslow probably could. And when they put it all together, they found there were more greens in the Onslow examples, which are these ones. And so they then did the cost comparison and discovered that Onslow was the cheapest site. They didn't have to do Tevenard Island after all. And that Onslow site is now being developed and is the site that they've chosen to develop that, and the Onslow community very involved in it. So what came out of it is that the Onslow community and the state authorities were very supportive. Because they did all that work, they let them do a PER instead of an ERMP, which saved them 18 months, which is a lot of money. And the NGOs were very supportive. They won all these awards, the Gecko and Bankshire Awards. It essentially was about some magic that was created. This is jazz, but it's also about that learning space, that policy learning, and the outcome emerged. There are all kinds of techniques for doing this. and you can learn about them. We certainly do all of these things at CUSP. Scenario planning and backcasting, goal setting through strategic planning, visualisation, deliberative techniques, demonstrations, and it is about tapping in community values. Jeanette Hartz-Karp runs our courses on deliberative democracy. She worked with Alana McTiernan on this dialogue with the city process, where we've got 1,200 people in one room in Fremantle and worked through the basis of the planning system, which is now part of Directions 2031. The adaptive and distributed leadership side of it is, as much as anything, about being strategic and flexible. If you look at the climate change debate, you wouldn't have thought that we could have come through this. It was so painful, wasn't it? The appalling overstatements and the lack of sensitivity about this major issue. And we all were sort of at each other's throats, and in the end it was announced, and it was a package that was important on the world stage. Australia up here, this is why we should lead in this area. We are so exorbitant in the amount of greenhouse gas we produce, so we did need to do something. But we weren't the leaders. There are 55 countries now with carbon taxes, carbon pricing, and we are part of that. But it was recognised globally that we did something significant, especially because America and Canada need help to move down this direction, and we took that step. The interesting thing is the politics of it. Down here, we've got a new idea. Came through with Al Gore's 2007 campaigns, and we had a lot of public support. There was sufficient political support to start that process. Then, as we got into the detail of it, oh dear, what that actually means is closing coal-fired power stations down, and whoa. And the whole lobbying process began, and the Australian emerged with its campaign to try and bring the government down, and at the lowest point of that, there's real panic sets in. This point is where you need to be a leader, isn't it, Brad? This is the point when it's hard. The public has left you, according to some sources, but really it was a hard time. But they got through it, and now you see it. It's going back up again because essentially it's not as hard as we thought. And power consumption is going down. The latest data I got just yesterday is extraordinary. What's happening across Australia, the signal that's been set by this package is we've got to stop using fossil fuels. This is what's happening. Boom, it's going down. There's something like, it says it on here, but there's about 600 megawatts of power not needed now in Australia. This is an amazing transformation that's happening. There was some leadership shown in that period. Now, I love this book, Artists, Craftsmen and Technocrats. I've applied it in many university situations. It's an analysis of what happened to a multinational corporation when it collapsed. And they interviewed all the people involved. And they said there are three kinds of groups of people in this organisation. The artists are those who have a new idea every day. The craftsmen are those who can tell you how to make it happen and show you the steps. And the technocrats are those who do the daily work of accounting and ensuring that things get done. All necessary people in any organisation. What the conclusion of this document was, never put a technocrat in charge, because all they can do is cut. All they can do is say, you're spending too much money, cut this, cut that, and that's what they did. They cut everything and the whole thing collapsed. They don't have any vision. second 3 was 4. He's a smart one. Right, we're going to talk about hope. Now, this is also something that people endlessly hear me talk about, but hope is a terrific word for sustainability. And it is about, and the literature does show it, about how we need to participate in an unfolding future. That history is about social movements. Now, read that synchronicity article in there. It's a beautiful article. It's about how a person involved in change showed the different phases of the interactions that enabled a major change to occur. It wasn't about an inevitable process that was going to happen anyway. It was about small steps and teams. Personality and leadership, there's a good article about that. It's deeply about hope. Where does it come from? There's a whole series of articles about emotional intelligence, empathy, friendliness with a purpose, personal security, honesty, and transformational change. They're all about what happens inside you. And there are so many examples that we could use. But generally, people who come from backgrounds that are deprived are not seen as leaders or the potential to be leaders, but they can be because they're driven by the need to overcome those issues of deprivation. And the hope that comes from that is amazing. Elul's article is about hubris, and it is about not seeing that you can do everything yourself. It's about that guns arrogance. Okay, we're going to talk about Argyle finally. Argyle is a mine in the Kimberley, and it is a lot more than about a mine. It is a diamond mine. It's the biggest diamond mine in the world. And this man, Brendan Hammond, came there from South Africa and said, where are all the Indigenous people working? There wasn't one there. In fact, they'd had a series of arrangements which were basically keep away as far as possible from the Indigenous people. And he said, no, this is not good enough. We need to train Indigenous people to be part of this workforce because that money will stay locally and it will enable them to have a much better future for their families. And of course, the local Indigenous people got involved in this. And they set up an agreement which was signed in Oka, and this is part of that. They now have 27% of their workforce Indigenous, and this happened in a 5-year process. Miko and Craig were part of this process, and we're going to go inside that a bit and find out about how it happened. But in the end, they say, unless mining can create a legacy of social value, we have no right to mine. Not too many mining companies say that, but in fact, it's increasingly the standard now because Argyle did it first. We need to follow through that story. And they even talk now about enduring value. I like the idea of the diamond, creating diamonds of hope. Now, what are diamonds? Diamonds, I mean, they are produced at Argyle, but they're discovered by scientists and engineers and geologists who can do the practical work of finding out where it is and then working out how to dig it out of the ground. But you create, in the end, a beautiful thing that lasts for generations. This is the legacy thing. This is what we're trying to do in sustainability. Leave a few diamonds of hope. And each one of you can do this. Each one of you has to find a diamond to create. And it is interesting in literature and theology and philosophy that diamonds represent that highest and best achievement of human beings. Why do we give people a diamond to represent a symbol of long-term value? Because that is symbolic of how we want the world to be. Now, I go to this local church here, and there's a lot of theology about diamonds and creating hope in that tradition. It's in fact in every religious tradition. And when I look at case studies around the world, like this one in Boulder, if you've ever heard of Boulder, it's a small town that took on sustainability very early on. It's now the US's most desired city to live in. Where did it come from? This couple here, Spence Havlick, was a professor of environmental design at Boulder and a councillor there for 23 years. Been to Fremantle many times because we had a lot in common. And he created these diamonds, including that library in the background, which is one of the first green buildings in the US. What about this? The guy who built this freeway as an engineer was elected to be the mayor of Seoul and took it down because that was the politics of it, and he led that campaign to take down what he said was a mistake, building a freeway on top of a river, and regenerated this area, made it a beautiful space that is now a diamond in the centre of Seoul. He's now the president of Korea, and he runs a whole series of campaigns and processes and policies about the green economy. There's lots of little diamonds. I met a woman in the Auckland City Council who has set up 130 walking school buses. These are where parents are brought together to help kids walk to school. Because kids walking to school is what always happened. And then we started driving them for their own good because of safety issues. It's the worst thing you can do for kids. They need the exercise and they need to discover their neighbourhoods. Walking school buses is one of the ways to do it. I think that's her diamond. I've got a few diamonds I can talk about, but this is the one that mostly I get asked to talk about, and that's the railway. That's me in 1979, the last train to Freo, along with my honours students and family, which is about all there was at that stage, that said we can actually build a railway in Perth. And if you go to the station, you can see the memorial to the closing and then the reopening. There's a lot of pain in that process. We had a 4-year campaign, which we won. And the Liberal government was thrown out as much over this as anything, and they've slowly been picking themselves up to say that they can build train lines. But the process of rebuilding that, the Northern Line and the Southern Line, which have been pretty extraordinary stories. And when people come back to Perth, as one did yesterday who was giving our seminar, he said the biggest change in Perth in the last 15 years is the railway, which is clearly a legacy that we needed to produce. And it was a great popular political thing, but not at the time. And it was a highly political process. The road lobby loved to roll out their roads, and we needed Alana McTiernan to tear that down and exercise this kind of leadership. The next part of the journey is light rail, and it will be happening now. And essentially, these stories are about leadership, but they are about making a difference. Someone asked me when we were at ISTP, what are you guys? And I said, we're misfits making a difference. We're misfits because we don't fit in disciplinary terms and professional terms, but we're trying to make a difference. And that's clearly the case at Murdoch and at Curtin now. And you really need to tell your own stories to make this happen. And it is the basis of the books that I write, the Resilient Cities and Green Urbanism Down Under. They're all stories. Let me finish with one story. This is Noel. Noel's a Fremantle personality. I met him first in Fremantle Jail, where he had been for many years. He taught himself to read and write in his 20s, had a very deprived background. And this is Fremantle Jail when it was on fire at one stage. But he was in one of the cells looking out on the Indian Ocean. And he used to dream of swimming in the Indian Ocean. That was his symbol of freedom. He was virtually locked up for life because he was a paranoid schizophrenic and he did not have any of the skills that would enable him to be seen to be contributing to society. But there was a group of people who took him on, including and led by Christabel Charmeret, who became a Green Senator for WA, still a Fremantle identity, who works in the psychology area. She was the first woman allowed into Fremantle Jail. She worked with Noel to help him create a new future for himself. He got to the point where he was allowed to be released into the community, and the first thing he did was go and swim in the Indian Ocean. And it was a sort of nice experience, but at the same time he discovered it was polluted because he swam off South Beach, where Rob's jetty had their effluent going straight into the ocean. And it was something that the Fremantle community had put up with for decades and decades. It was part of life here, and yeah, okay, there are sharks out there and so on, but you know, that's what you have to put up with because this is an important business. Now, he was appalled about this. He started a group called Fremantle Community Action, which is mostly him, and he learned how to write letters to ministers and demand attention and get media attention, and essentially ran a campaign. And it alerted various public servants to this issue, and one of them came up with the fact that there was a pipeline going right past Rob's jetty that could take that effluent away. The minister was told about this and he said, I will do that immediately. So at the ceremony where they switched off that effluent pipeline and turned it back in and to be treated in the way it should always have been, Noel was there and was recognised as the person who helped to achieve that. So if you go to South Beach today, you will see beaches that are clean and beautiful. You can swim off there. There are dolphins there. Noel still does it and says that the dolphins come up and tell him thanks. It's a diamond that he contributed. Now, there's no way in the world anybody could have predicted that he would lead that campaign. So anyone can produce a diamond of hope, and that's leadership. Thank you.